I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Heather Shank. I'm the city planner for the Concord Planning Division. And this is a presentation. This online webinar is about phase 2 of the ConcordNEXT zoning update. Just to give you a quick overview. And go to the next, there we go. So phase 1 is available for public review now. It's posted on the project website, which is www.concordnext.info. There are a number of presentations scheduled, a few of them online, such as this, and then I also have a few in person scheduled in the next few weeks. There are also some supporting documents online if you have gone there to check a few things to sort of help you orient yourself to some of the information. And I'm still continuing to produce these documents to help people sort of get a handle on these things. These are the first sets of meetings that are scheduled, and then based on how these go and the type of feedback I get, I may schedule some additional meetings. It's a lot of information to process, so we'll see how much I'm able to get through with these first sets of meetings and what type of feedback I'm getting. So this webinar is about phase 1. Phase 2. This is phase 2. Can you go back one? Yeah, thank you. So phase 1 was really about the bulk of the city, most of the districts, as well as the ordinance in general. Phase 2 is looking at very specific areas that we didn't feel that we had enough real public input on what the community would like, how the community would like to see these areas coded moving forward in the future. We didn't have a lot of direction necessarily from our master plans about how these areas should develop moving forward. So this is a bit of a charrette type visioning process to sort of get some feedback. We had some ideas in phase, the first set of meetings. So this meeting is following up on the visioning sessions that we had back in March. Basically looking at the local commercial areas. So that's Loudon Road and Fisherville Road, looking at the gateway performance districts, which we've got a few, mainly the mall. We've got some at the different interchange entrances as well. Local flex, and so we're looking at something also called, we're calling flex industrial, which is some of these industrial areas or previously zoned or currently zoned office park performance areas, which are sort of underutilized with inappropriate zoning and could maybe be better, have something more appropriate in these areas. So we included them as part of this process. And then the multi-unit residential areas, which are in close proximity to most of the general commercial areas. So now you can go ahead to the next screen. So right here, what we're doing is the design concept. So the last step in visioning, we picked these 4 areas and we showed a bunch of different concepts for what's the existing development and how could this develop moving forward. And so based on the feedback that we got from those, we're now in phase 3, or step 3 rather, which is looking at some specific areas of the city and developing the concepts from those from the visioning that we did. So you can move ahead one more slide. So this is where we are. The past few months, our consultants have been formulating those concepts, basically designing on those sites, which are fairly large areas, to show how those concepts would look if we had them in Concord, if we developed in this way. So the next step after this, based on the feedback from this session, will be actually drafting the code. And so the next set of meetings will be presenting what came out of it and getting feedback on that, and then further revisions from there. Hopefully in the long-term plan would be to combine it with phase 1 and adopt it when everything gets all set together. You can go ahead to the next slide. So the Visioning 2 session, as I said, was a series of slides for the different areas of the city showing what we have existing and what type of development we could encourage with new codes. So we did little polls throughout there to try to get some feedback on what people preferred, if they liked what we had currently, if they would prefer that we draft codes that allow different types of development. So in general, we saw that people were prioritizing this sort of more pedestrian oriented development over the more vehicular oriented layouts. They liked the improved walkability, more housing types. Some of the precedents showed mixed uses of housing and just other types of housing in general that we don't currently have in Concord, and more mixing of uses in some of these districts that have been single use commercial districts. So the 4 sites that we chose, we looked at these again last time. And this time is where these are those 4 sites where the concepts were developed based on the feedback from the last meeting. So I believe the first one we're looking at is Loudon Road. Then we're looking at Fisherville Road, and then the Southern OCP corridor. That one is more looking at the general layout. It's really difficult to generate a plan or kind of conceptualize future development if you don't have connectivity or kind of a street infrastructure or grid to see what could go there. And then finally, we're going to be looking at the mall site on Demonte Drive. So our consultants are joining us to present what they've been working on. We've got Kelsey Morrow, who did most of the design work. Lee Einsweiler is here as well. He'll mostly be silent through this unless we need him for anything. But with that, I'll hand it over to Kelsey and she can share the concept she's been working on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Heather.
Oh, I'm sorry. Before we move on, I just want to reiterate and stress that these are intended to be Q&A sessions. So please, if you have questions, you can write them in the chat box. We will be asking for your feedback. So those will be opportunities to either verbally tell us what you think, or you can write it in the chat box, or you can even send me an email about how you feel about some of the presentation. But I just want to reiterate, we do want feedback. We want to know how, we want to help you understand what we're doing, and we want to know how you feel about it. Thanks.
Yeah. And yeah, so I'm going to be running through each of the 4 sites that Heather just mentioned. So at any point through that, feel free to also use the little raise your hand button at the bottom. And when we get to the nice pause at the end of each section for discussion, then we'll get to you for sure.
I also want to clarify that we're not proposing plans that will be adopted. We are using these examples, using these locations, what Kelsey's got outlined here, as an example of, if we had these types of codes, this is the type of development that we could create in these areas. And so a lot of these developments span multiple lots, multiple parcels, and would involve a lot of coordination to create. The goal is not to say, hey, let's create this here in the future in Concord, but to show you, if you were to take an area like this is something that could be created here. Just to clarify that, I don't want anybody to think we're proposing, stuff on their property that we don't have permission to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. I'll stop now.
Very important. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the first site that we're going to look at today is the Loudon Road site. And this is this piece right where Loudon Road intersects with Eastside Drive. So just to help y'all get oriented, this is the, I think, Red Apple Buffet restaurant here on the corner, and then the CBS and the Walgreens, and I think Pizza Hut on the other side of the intersections. And within this site, we have some, commercial properties, including that restaurant, and I think an Aaron's rental facility, and but mostly it's a lot of older apartment buildings and some single family homes along Eastside Drive here. And while we're looking at this site from this angle, I just want to point out, when we look at this aerial, just how limited the connectivity through the site is here. And by limited, it's basically non-existent. There really are no routes through this site whatsoever. It's really, you drive in a driveway to go into wherever you're trying to get to, and you come out of that exact same driveway. So let's see. As we take a look at some of the existing conditions along Loudon roads, this might help you understand better where you're at right now. We can really see how poor the pedestrian environment is here in this section. You do have sidewalks along Loudon, but unfortunately there's not much, if anything, separating the sidewalks from busy Loudon Road. And the sidewalks are interrupted by these large curb cuts that are very frequent along Loudon Road, these driveways into these parking lots. And then also, if you're walking down this road, you're walking between the busy street and just, for the most part, these parking lots. So not a super pleasant environment. And like I mentioned before, just a very disconnected street network as a whole throughout this site. So let's take a look at what the possible future for this area could potentially look like. And like Heather mentioned, this is just an example. What we're showing here is Mixed use development pulled up along Loudon Drive. That's the purple buildings that you're seeing. And when we say mixed use, we just mean buildings that have primarily commercial ground floors, so retail spaces on the ground floor, and then apartments or possibly even office spaces or other uses on any upper floors. Then we've got apartment buildings, which are the orange buildings, and then townhomes that we're showing on the north side. And then any of the buildings with this kind of hatching mark are existing buildings that are already on the site that we could see as potentially, being fine to stick around as the site redevelops in the future. So that includes some apartment buildings here along Loudon and the single family homes on East Side Drive. And we're going to dive into the details of this little site plan a little bit more, starting with street improvements. So starting with that, proposing a connected street network, like I mentioned before, and just creating a more connected and overall walkable environment. And that also creates more route options for both drivers and pedestrians. So, now if you were to come in and you wanted to park at these apartment complexes, you don't have to come in and out right on Loudon Road, but you could potentially, use any of these other roads to get out of this area. So freeing up some congestion along Loudon Road. With the street improvements, we also want to think about streetscape improvements. So all of the roads that we're showing here include sidewalks as well as planted tree lawns separating the sidewalks from the roads, just to help really improve that pedestrian experience and promote walkability in this area, especially now that we have these nice connections that connect people from their homes to shopping and a mix of uses, all within the site that's now an easy reach with these sorts of connections. And then finally, limiting curb cuts, especially along Loudon Road, like we saw in those photos. A majority of, the street edge of Loudon Road was driveways. But in a plan like this, you see that those curb cuts are limited now to just 4 for this entire stretch of Loudon Road. So a big improvement there with helping walkability as well. And then we can look at mixed use buildings that we're talking about. So these purple buildings. And we're showing these pulled up to the street, so right along the sidewalk edge along Loudon and East Side Drive. And that's just, again, promoting that walkability as well as by doing that, we're able to put the parking behind the building, just overall improving the public realm for this area. And then looking at the different housing types that could go here. So what we're showing here is just a couple of examples of housing types that could go here. But there are obviously a lot more options, but here we're showing apartment buildings ranging from larger to smaller, as well as townhomes. And you'll notice that we're trying to be careful to step back that intensity of the housing development as we do get closer to the existing single family neighborhoods that's adjacent to the site on the northern edge. So that's where we have these townhomes lining that. And we're also making sure to keep the context of these existing single family homes here on East Side Drive. So Loudon Road could potentially end up looking something more like this if we apply these principles. So we're seeing here maybe a bike lane with a buffer protecting the cyclists from the cars. We see a landscaped area with all sorts of pedestrian amenities like benches and pedestrian scaled lighting and a wide sidewalk. And we're seeing, active storefronts, really just design that focuses more on people and a little bit less on cars. And if you can look here, this before and after. So this rendering is drawn over top of almost exactly where this photo was taken. So this is a place where we want to pause and kind of open up the floor to y'all and ask, is this a desirable outcome? Is this something, are these things that you would like to see in this site? Are these things that you would not like to see? Do you have any comments, questions, anything? Feel free to raise your hand or just leave a message in the chat if you're more comfortable with that. And I think looks like Roland has his hand raised. So Roland, if you want to unmute yourself and
Yeah, the only comment I have is I would like to see a divider, like a Jersey barrier of some sort or some other barrier that separates the bike lane from the traffic rather than just a 2-foot hash mark on the pavement.
Yeah, that would be ideal for sure.
Hi, Heather. This is Al Hirschlag. I was just wondering what the difference in capacity for Loudon Road would be compared to the current configuration with the proposed configuration.
That's a good question. That's a good question, Alan. We haven't looked really at traffic counts. I believe Loudon Road is somewhere around the 20,000 count right now. I'm trying to remember back during the Loudon Road process, because I think they obviously talked a lot more about what the capacity of the improvement could be. And I want to say that it was like well within the range of that, but I just don't have that information for you offhand, but I think that's a really good question. And, traffic, road alignment, road layout and road design, it's kind of a separate conversation. But as a planner, I wouldn't want to design the street around the road. I'd rather design the road around the street. So in other words, rather than saying, well, what can this road take? And then we're only going to put this there, say, what do we want here? And what road do we need to handle it? I think the other issue I would point out is that this type of development with this interconnectivity tends to reduce congestion on the main road, because when you have more avenues, all that traffic's not just dumping on to one road, it's going on multiple roads, which is how sort of downtown urban areas work. We have the density that we have downtown, but we've got State Street and Stores Ave and Main Street and Green Street. The more streets that we have, the better, the less congestion that we have, even though we have this high degree of density in an area.
So if I could just follow up on that, I noticed that the two exits that were proposed from this development block were on East Side Drive and Loudon Road. And the crossover on East Side Drive is already difficult. You already have the pharmacy there, which also empties out into Burger King, trying to come in or make a left turn onto East Side Drive. And so again, there's times of the day, particularly when the state is letting out, I just can't imagine adding more crossover traffic to East Side Drive or Loudon Road, regardless of how it's configured in 2 or 3 or 4 lanes, while adding the number of people that are going to utilize that area. I think this is a wonderful concept. I'm just not sure how you make it work.
So I think you were right in the thick of all of the discussions about traffic during the discussions about Loudon Road. And I guess I would sort of, I'm not a traffic engineer, so I don't necessarily, we need to consider these things, and there's certainly important questions. I'm tempted to sort of fall back on a sort of stock answer, like, well, we have plenty of examples out there in the world of really busy urban areas, and I'm just saying urban sort of casually, because this is obviously different from downtown, but of areas that have high, employee or high usage during rush hour, for instance, and they're able to make those work. And I don't think that Concord is really a special case in that regard, that, oh, that can work everywhere else, but it can't work here. I think it's a matter of figuring out, doing traffic models to show what does work and what you need to make it work. We're not reinventing the wheel here. These are sort of standard traffic problems that those in the planning and transportation world, solve sort of regularly. So I think that we need those people to sort of look at that if we were to have a big project come along that wanted to do something like that.
So I'll just finish up. I'm sorry to keep on going. I would just hope that as we're looking at this, we're looking at all the components together, not saying, well, this is what we'd like, and then we find out when a project comes in that we don't have the road capacity for, or we find that because of the type of project, it's going to move traffic in a direction that we don't want, as opposed to limiting traffic, having more walkable destinations or bikeable destinations. We wind up creating the opposite. So I would hope all those components come together as opposed to being looked at separately.
Right.
Because if we go through doing this exercise and then we find out that we don't have the traffic capacity, well, what have we gained? Or vice versa. Or how do we ensure that we're reducing or not increasing the traffic capacity so that we don't overload roads that are already currently overloaded?
Sure. Yeah, and I would just stress that part of the goal of this is to reduce traffic. I mean, that is part of the goal on Loudon Road, is to reduce the congestion and reduce the traffic. We also have 393, like we literally have a major bypass right running parallel to Loudon Road. So if anything, you know, persuading more people to take that route if they can and don't need to go on Loudon Road is not a bad thing. But I hear what you're saying, and I definitely agree. Traffic is a huge, transportation in general is a huge part of why we do this. And you know, Loudon Road is a situation that really can only be improved. But we had a question.
Yeah, it looks like Mark has his hand raised.
Hi there, and thanks for this. This looks great, and you know, encouraging to see on first look. But I'm sort of wondering, you know, does the code that we'd be switching to, what does it look like in actual practice to sort of get this connected type of community? Because I imagine there's probably 20 separate lot owners here. And would you sort of have this weird intermediate stage where you have this big mixture of connected neighborhoods, but then also this old or current Loudon Road style? Like, what does that look like in sort of in practice once the code would be implemented?
So I'm going to maybe defer to Kelsey or Lee because they worked in communities that have done this. I would just say from my own perspective, the main thing we're trying to do here is enable these things to happen. So it might look like something in terms of reduced setbacks, reduced frontage requirements, smaller lot area requirements, or higher density requirements, so that people could start redeveloping in a higher density way. And it would be sort of an interim thing. You unless you did have property owners collaborating, you know, it would be sort of a step by step. And again, just allowing people to do this is really the first step. But I think hopefully also showing these types of images can encourage property owners and developers that, oh, wow, the city's going to let me do this. Maybe we'll renovate this property and increase its capacity, keep our current use, but put additional things on here, you know, that type of thing. So I would turn it over, Lee, if you have something to add.
I was going to say, one of the key things that would happen early days is you would see street stubs in specific locations because a single property would redevelop and it would stub to the, you know, east and west and north and south, and in general, then the next property over is going to connect to that street stub. So you're building that network out somewhat incrementally. If the parcel or set of parcels that's being developed is not large enough to sort of have their own street and block grid, then you would be developing that over time by stubbing land to adjacent parcels.
Which is something that we already do for development on Loudon Road. You may be able to see from some of the developments on the south side that are more recent in the past 10 years or so, connecting driveways. And, you know, there's been a real attempt to line those driveways up and have those cross connections exactly to set up for something like this in the future. So I think this type of connectivity and creating this type of grid is something the city's been doing for a long time, even before these types of regulations enabled that to happen. And that again is to avoid, to minimize congestion on Loudon Road, because if you have these interconnected, you know, these interconnected sites, then people don't need to go out on Loudon Road, go down, you know, a quarter mile and then come back in to the next site. They can just, you know, go down that back street.
Mark, go ahead.
On that point there, and I know talking with Nicole Fox, who's a traffic planner, and others, that yeah, this connectivity and sort of creating multiple route options does alleviate traffic. But I'm wondering what we need to think about in terms of encouraging pedestrian or cyclist safety if we're doing a lot of rerouting along these back streets. Is that raised speed tables? Is that stop signs? Like, how do you basically, you know, I won't disagree that like removing congestion from Loudon Road and optimizing drivers getting from A to B is a good thing. But what are, you know, how do we also ensure that's a safe experience for all, including human powered transportation?
Yep, and this is something that we struggle with now when we're looking at plans. Even now, we're trying to say, okay, where's the bike connectivity? Where's the pedestrian connectivity? You know, that's, and I think if we had these types of regulations in place, that would be kind of folded in there for sure. But it would just put more of an emphasis on something we're already trying to do, but we don't necessarily have, you know, standardized in the regulations. You were going to add something, Lee?
Just that I think the key here is that if you build the new pieces in a new way, that puts those elements sort of first and has car access, but does not treat car access as the only access, then you'll have made everyone's lives easier as they move, you know, back within the block there. So it's about new street and sidewalk standards that are safe in those newer spaces.
Yeah, and I think this relates to why we're doing these types of presentations, is to show property owners, the community, and developers what we can create and what we should expect. So sometimes I've heard people say in the past, well, I don't want a sidewalk here. I don't want to be liable. You know, they want to encourage, or they're sort of incentivized to encourage the vehicular oriented development because they don't want the liability of anything happening. So I think in some ways, what we're trying to encourage is sort of a change in the way that we're viewing these spaces in the community and seeing like, hey, does the community want this type of space? And if so, can we require developers to create these types of connected spaces where pedestrians, we expect and want them to go, rather than just saying, well, we only want people to drive around here because that's all we want to design for. It's possible. It's definitely possible to create, but we need to, as a community, sort of adopt that this is what we want to create.
Roland has his hand up.
Yeah, in the after drawing or depiction, is it an oversight or an intention to not show the overhead utility lines?
That's artistic license.
Okay. Well,
I think
no,
you're absolutely right. I think these types of drawings are sort of famous for not including that type of infrastructure that's definitely going to be there. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Okay.
And
it's not intentional in the regard that, yeah, we're literally proposing to underground the utilities. You know, it's more like, you know, we want you to focus on these types of things, and so they're just not included.
Well, so are you saying, did I hear you say that part of the zoning changes is to request underground or to?
No, I'm saying we're not literally representing this like, yeah, we're gonna ask for underground utilities. It's just, I don't think that's a feasible ask at this point in time.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we can't even get that all over downtown at this point. So
Right.
So no, that's not, we do currently ask for underground on the site. So on the street in the right of way, you know, it's still permitted that they be above ground, but from the right of way to the site itself, it has to be underground.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have a couple of comments and questions in the chat that I'll just read through really quickly. So Anna says that she likes to focus on walkability and bikeability. Sarah says, this is a beautiful plan. And she asks, how can the city ensure affordability for the current communities living here? And she also says that she agrees with Anna, the walkability and bikeability is ideal, and investing in this kind of infrastructure is great. So we should address her question on affordability for the current people currently living there.
Yeah, I think affordability is definitely important. I sort of like to talk about the fact that the only developments, the only residential developments we've successfully got approved and under construction are all affordable housing projects in the city. So I think it's important that we continue to encourage and allow for that type of thing. I think for some of these, I guess it depends where the money comes from. You know, I mean, so I think the reason some of the affordable projects have been built is because they are able to get funding for those things. And that's true for mixed use projects as well. So there may be people out there with resources or knowledge of some of these funding sources that would be really interested in investing something like this. So I think that's part of the answer. We desperately need housing of all demographics. So I don't know that we're in a place to sort of require affordable as part of a project. But, you know, depending on how we move forward, you know, we'll see how that is in the future.
Oh, yeah, the reason I ask, and I hope you don't mind if I elaborate, is that I think about like our refugee and immigrant community that's concentrated on Loudon Road.
Yeah.
I actually like brought up this project to some folks from that community today, and they got really excited about it. So one of my, like, when you make things beautiful, people want to be there. So I'm just trying to remain cognizant of that community in particular that would really benefit from a project like this. And also, like, there's the reality of displacement, because spaces like this are desirable for everyone. So just sort of like keeping them in mind as projects in that part of the community, which I'm like, this is exciting. I would want to see more development and improvement in the Loudon Road corridor. But, you know, keeping that population in mind as we move forward, I think is, you know, I know the city has that in mind too, but I felt like an obligation.
No, I think you make an excellent point, because to the extent that this may be an area where there is affordable housing currently, we don't want to replace it. We don't want to eliminate affordable housing. That's not the goal, you know. So definitely, you know, the desire would be at least a 1-to-1 replacement in terms of affordable housing there. We certainly do not want to take it away and not make it better. So thank you for that. That's a really good point.
Earl, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. Heather, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, as a member of the planning board, I've certainly sat through this, and this is great, and we've talked about it at length. But what you're really presenting here, and this is my question, is what you're really presenting here future guidelines under which we would do our planning and approvals, as opposed to projects that are in the works now. I sometimes worry that people will go out and say, oh, we're about to change where the buffet is now on the corner of Eastside Drive and Loudon Road, and that becomes a project. That's just an example of how these new planning guidelines would work. Is that correct?
So I kind of lost the straight. Let me answer what I think your question was. So once this actually gets posted, which is down the line, the ordinance itself, once it gets posted for public hearings for review by council, at that point, there's sort of a legal requirement that projects that are under that haven't been submitted yet would be aware, okay, we need to look at this and do our due diligence, because we'll be responsible if this is adopted for adhering to it. You know, at this point now, no, I mean, if a project comes before us, we may say, hey, we'd really like if you put the sidewalk here. Well, it's required. The sidewalk is required. So that's not a good example, but we'd really like if you do X, Y, Z. You know, I've been doing that for the past 5 years, you know, and so we tell them, we hope you do this, but we have no, you know, regulatory authority to make you do this, and you'll end up doing what you're allowed and want to do. So I think that's where we're at now. We could say, hey, we'd love for you to do this, but it's not, they're allowed to do whatever they are allowed to do. And I think my hope is that we show this to developers and property owners and they say, oh, wow. And this has happened with a few that I've talked with. They said, oh, wow, I can do that. I'm going to wait, because I want to do something like that. It's very few, it's not, I haven't had the experience of being like, hey, we're going to allow all this extra stuff to occur. And somebody's gone like, oh, well, I need to get this thing in really quickly under the radar. So, because I don't want to do any of that. So does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I think this is, if people can walk away with, this is what the future, if this is accepted and passed by the city council, this will be the primary guidelines for planning development in the city of Concord.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important, we haven't written the code yet, so we don't know.
Right.
It's not necessarily the case. I mean, we're showing you sort of the best case scenario. It's not necessarily the case where someone would come in to redevelop the red apple and be like, well, you build this or you build nothing. That's not what the intention is. So I think my first thought, without having drafted a code or seeing what it might look like, is that we are allowing this. I just keep trying to stress that we are allowing this. So what else we allow, I think, is a question that we haven't answered yet. Do we allow something that is a compromise of this? Do we allow exactly what's out there now, but also allow this? So those are some questions that we all have to answer together. I don't know the answers yet.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
So just a couple more comments from the chat box, but Jay says it looks nice and that they hope that we can get others excited about something like this. And then Anna had a question about parking. She was asking, does the proposed zoning plan reduce or change the required amount of parking for businesses? Or does it just incentivize the parking to be in a different location?
So yeah, definitely incentivize to be in a different location. The parking in general, globally, we kind of tweaked to be more in line with like current needs and standards. So in general, I think the overall the parking, and this is in the phase 1 draft, has been reduced, to be appropriate to what the market today would need. In a lot of cases, we find that, the developer, they know how much parking they need, and we're not interested in making them provide more. So that if anything, the emphasis is on requiring less. So I hope that answers the question. So in general, all of the parking throughout the city has sort of been updated, I'll say.
And then Karen asks about, would overnight street parking be allowed, or would there be a parking garage? And I think no.
Yeah, I think that those are council questions. I don't think those are changes or proposals that we're making at this stage. I think that would be great ultimately someday in the future. But what we're doing after the zoning ordinance updates is we'll be jumping into the master plan update for the whole city for transportation and housing and all sorts of things. So I think during that master plan process, that would be a great question to ask at that time and sort of put that on the community's radar, on council's radar, ultimately, eventually in the future, develop CIPs if that's what we decide we want to do. So that's a great forward thinking question, not something we're trying to tackle at this point.
All right. There's no more comments. Maybe we'll move on to the second site. That was good. I think those are all really important topics to bring up. They're going to apply, those same things are going to apply to the next 3 sites we look at.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, that was good. So moving on to site number 2, we're going to look up on Fisherville Road. So a little bit north. This is near the intersection of Manor Road up here. And there's a big, to get you oriented, there's a big, I think, car wash facility here next to self-storage facilities. And on this side, the CC Tomatoes restaurant is right here next to the Dollar General or Dollar Tree and the O'Reilly's Auto Parts. So that's where we're looking at next. So taking a look at what's on the ground there right now, again, some of the similar problems that we saw on the Loudon Road example. So limited pedestrian facilities. On this top image, we do actually have a nice planting strip separating the sidewalk from the road, which is great. Unfortunately, as we can see on the bottom image, that did not transfer to the other side of the road. So this cute little couple is stuck walking right next against Fisherville Road. You do have bike lanes on this road, which is great. There's not really a buffer there. There's definitely room for improvement, but it is awesome that there are bike lanes here. Again, we're seeing a lot of large curb cuts interrupting the sidewalk along the street. And again, large parking lots separating the pedestrians from the buildings along this road. So let's take a look at a potential future for this area under the new code. So again, same sorts of building types that we're looking at here. So some mixed use buildings lining Fisherville Road. So really activating that main road there, and also keeping those existing businesses like the CC's Tomatoes in place and kind of integrating some more commercial development into this area. And then wide variety of housing types, again, stepping back in intensity as we get to the existing single family neighborhoods around the site. So again, starting with looking at street improvements and creating another connected street network through the site, with even possible future connections to some of the existing neighborhoods around the area potentially. And again, just like what we talked about on Loudon Road, having all of those benefits of walkability and multiple routes and points of access through the site. And again, on all of these streets, we're showing improved streetscape elements like sidewalks and planted tree lawns to improve that pedestrian environment. Let's go back. And then looking really quickly at the mixed use development. So again, pulling the buildings up to the street, really activating that street edge, putting the parking hidden behind those buildings in the back, and just really working to make a more active pedestrian realm. And again, by mixed use buildings, this would mean that the commercial businesses would have an active shop fronts on the ground floor with housing above. And then looking at the different housing types that could potentially go in this space. And again, these are just a few of the many potential examples, but here we're showing a range from apartment buildings, which are the darker orange, down to townhomes, which are on these middle blocks here. And then even down one step lower down to small lot single families, as we're directly adjacent to some existing more traditional single family homes here in this neighborhood. So this is our rendering for what the potential for this area could look like. So this is kind of drawn as if you're standing kind of in that back area of the neighborhood, with townhomes shown on the left and in the background here, and then those small lot detached single family homes shown what those could potentially look like on the right. So just a couple different housing types, as well as all those streetscape improvements that we'd love to see here. So this is the before and after here. So you can see from this aerial view that we have those businesses that I pointed out, and then down to a couple homes over here, but it's largely just natural lots here in the back. And then we're talking about the sorts of housing development that we might see here. So again, I'll open up the floor. Is this a desirable outcome? What do you like? What do you not like? Any comments or questions?
So I haven't figured out how to hit the checkbox for the for raising my hand. So this is literally right in my backyard. I live in West Village, and I'm looking at it. It's a very nice plan, but I'm also looking at the new development or the newer development on Alice Drive, which is about 25 years old. And when they came in and developed that, they took all the trees down. And while there's no reason that this development right off of Alice Drive there's very, very few plantings that have gone in over the 25 or 30 years or so that development's been there. Very dissimilar to what's occurred in my neighborhood, where there's been a considerable amount of landscaping done. So it would be very desirable to have a plan in place before the development occurred. But I'm looking at that, even with the retail or commercial development, without grocery stores or local retail, all these houses and all these apartments are going to have to get into their car to go to exit 17 or go to Fort Eddy Road to shop. And I know if I was a neighbor on Alice Drive, that development in there, I wouldn't be very excited to see all that traffic emptying into my neighborhood in order to access Borough Road. And unfortunately, there was a plan when Earl's neighborhood was built to bypass his neighborhood and be able to connect Borough and Bog roads. But unfortunately, that because of wetlands that weren't identified at the time, that was never put in place. So again, the concern to me is, while this is an excellent example of how to increase density and try to find neighborhood retail, without the specifics, what I see is the potential for creating a second Loudon Road on Fisherville Road. So what type of assurances, or how would you go about to ensure that something like that wouldn't occur?
Sorry, I forgot where my mute button was. I would say that for the most part, Fisherville Road already is substantially similar to Loudon Road. If we did nothing, it would certainly be a carbon copy of Loudon Road. And, because just because it hasn't been developed yet, doesn't mean there's plenty of space out there, and it's zoned exactly the same way. So in effect, the plan we have now is to duplicate out Loudon Road on Fisherville Road in our current zoning. And so I think the goal here is to halt that progression in the case of Fisherville Road and reverse it if possible on Loudon Road. So that's really what we're talking about here, is trying to create connectivity, trying to create multiple routes to things. This is just a first step. Obviously, connecting with Alice Drive in the way that we're showing here may or may not ever happen. But the ideal would be that there would be more avenues for access, so that they're not all just funneling out onto Fisherville Road. Or that they're actually walking, because they have places that they do want to walk to that are close by. These are not just purple boxes here. These are designed to be amenities that people may want to actually walk to. So instead of going out on Fisherville Road and driving to downtown Concord or downtown Pennacook, they're just walking down the street because there's a cool place they want to eat at.
Mark's got his hand up.
Thanks again, and I think this is exciting and looks really great in a number of ways. Sort of building on what Alan was talking about, say potentially this project goes through, you're going to cut down a lot of those trees, and that might not be public space currently. But when I look at this overhead, I see a lot of residential areas and a lot of really good new high density, which is great. But what I don't see is spots where kids can go play in a park, ball fields, places for dogs to go walk. How do you build into this a sense of very localized green space that makes it livable beyond just sort of improved commercial upgrade use? And maybe, Heather, that's like a larger plan of Concord about how do you basically, if we are going to basically greenlight developments, which these new ones are great, how are we also ensuring that we're balancing open space resources that people want to see?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's definitely more doable when you have somebody that, like, if somebody, this is only like 4 or 5 parcels here, I think, like something like that, or not many, maybe it's more than that. But when you have larger areas that you can comprehensively plan for, in in a comprehensive way that you could include that. So for instance, if you just had someone that owned this little block on the corner, they're not necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily make sense for them just to provide one little green space, and then this guy over here to provide another little green space. So what we tried to sort of communicate that, behind, I think is that CC's that's behind the green space that you included in there?
O'Reilly's, I think.
Okay, so we did try to include this space on the corner here, but I mean, you could take that whole, you could extend that all the way to the single family block and just, you could just take that whole thing and make it green space. I completely see your point, and I agree with you.
So if I could jump in real quickly, there's 12 acres of undeveloped land, 5 that belong to West Village and 7 to the apartments, Pennacook Place, I can't. And so if that was left undeveloped, that would provide quite a nice green space and more of a passive park than recreational fields. There's, I don't know how many thousands of people living within a half mile of that intersection of Mayflower and Fisherville, which is less, it's just a couple of 100 yards. Well, you can see right across from Windsor is where some of that open space is, that area right in there. And that would make a very nice passive green recreation area for people in the community, particularly for those with lower incomes and not readily and don't have ready access to transportation. So as you increase density, it becomes even more important to look at maintaining some open space, even though the potential to develop it is tempting because of additional revenues. I think you want to try to balance that out for a quality of life type issues. And I just want to remark quickly, at least one charrette in Pennacook, when we were talking about what to do along Fisherville Road, the majority consensus was to, if possible, to combine those 2 lots for passive green space.
Yeah, and that's something I would say is a council should be a council directed action to maybe RPAC or or to some degree to look at where should additional passive recreation spaces be, but those would need to be sort of purchased by the city, or that would need to be something that the city would need to do, because we wouldn't ask a private property owner like, hey, why don't you just donate 10 acres to passive recreation? I mean, there'd really have to be something substantial in it for them to do that. But yeah, I think that's where the council comes in with future planning. So again, it may be one of those issues where we look at it in the master plan, like where do we need more recreation? And I think certainly if we started to developing this corridor like this, it would be totally appropriate to do something like that, in the vicinity. I'm looking at some of the comments that we have here.
So I was about to say, Anna says that she would like to see prioritizing bike lanes, and comments, depending on where you are in Concord, biking here can be pretty unsafe.
Yeah, and I think that there's been a little bit of a difficult conversation because from a really progressive planning perspective, we like to see separated bike lanes, where families and kids and people can actually feel comfortable, not just professional bikers, but people with children could feel comfortable biking somewhere. But the city just redid Fisherville Road and they put those bike lanes on there. And I think that's definitely a source of pride that we got those bike lanes in there, and it's a good start. I think ultimately, we would like to see exactly that, at least from a planning perspective, for sure.
Yeah. And then Anna also asks, is there a way to incentivize developers to include thinking about community spaces in addition to the commercial space? I like the higher density in the different types of housing, as well as the idea that there are walkable businesses that people in the community would want to visit.
So in some places, what they do is they offer density incentives for creating public spaces. I think that's a great idea. It's not something we've necessarily focused on in Concord because people haven't really been trying to max out the density that they're already able to get. So if you're already able to get, you know, a 3-story multi-unit building, and yet you're only building 2 or something else, you know, the density incentive isn't going to mean much to you. But I think as redevelopment starts to gain traction and people start to realize what the potential really is, and maybe they want those development incentives, we certainly could look at incentives for public space, because that's one of the few ways to really do it. There's no way you can really, I mean, of course you can do anything. Council can make any rule or regulation that they legally can per state statute, but it's not a very popular move necessarily to say, oh, and by the way, you're going to be required to provide, you know, X amount of space. But I don't know, maybe we'll propose that.
We have coded for cities before as a code studio that do require X amount of space per lot for developments that might be over a certain size or of a certain type. They must hit amount to amenity space.
Yeah, so that's great.
And Heather, if I can just sort of follow up on that, but it's really popular for who to sort of build into these requirements as part of it, and whether that's affordable housing or community spaces, or, you know, take whatever sort of thing we want to build into this. You know, maybe developers don't like it, but I think a lot of people here in Concord would. And I think this is the kind of city that we want to see. And so I think that's obviously the challenge of balancing the sort of community's needs with what developers are willing and able to do. But I think that's something that I would challenge City Council to be open about, and to sort of really ask, what do we want to see out of our community? So I understand this is obviously with a developer focus, and zoning impacts them greatly, but it impacts all of us.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. Those would be, you know, those would be points, excellent points to bring up with your council person, or to talk to council about and put that on their radar, because they're the ones that are going to need to make these decisions and be able to feel strongly about them and support them. So it's not like a us versus them thing in terms of developers and community members, but you know, it's really important for the community to let council know and developers know that this is what they want, because, you know, what I don't want is to put a bunch of really cool stuff in there and then have it get axed at the last minute because, you know, 3 big developers say, I don't want to do that. That's crazy. You'll put me out of business. So it really is a community discussion, and I really appreciate you bringing it up.
Mark, did you have something to add?
Nope, that's it. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Heather.
Mhm.
So again, if I could just reiterate, I think, again, I think plans like this are wonderful. They look great. And the comments that have ensued to improve them are very important. But I think it's even more important that we look at all the components together, not just increasing the density and how that works, but also looking at to ensure that if density increases, that we also have set aside open space ahead of time, not hoping that that open space will be available at a future date. And the same with traffic, that we really need to look forward as we're doing this type of zoning to understand the impact it will or won't have on traffic. But if we look at it piecemeal, I think we're going to wind up playing catch up, something that we've done all too often. So I don't know if the full scope, if the scope of this will allow for all those components to be looked at together, but without looking at them together, I don't know how we improve. The potential is that we'll wind up having the same issues that we've had in the past.
Okay.
Thanks, Alan. You want to move on, Kelsey?
That looks like we've got just under 30 minutes, so in pretty good shape, but
Yeah.
moving. So site number 3 is the mall site. So focusing along DeMonte Drive here. We've got Loudon Road up here to the north and Sheep Davis Road over on the east side. So we've got the big mall here right in the center. Sure you'll recognize it. And then this white roof building is the Shaw's. We've got the Home Depot, and then down here, just out of frame, is the Target, I think Target Shopping Center. So taking a look at the existing conditions for this area, again, very limited pedestrian facilities. We've got a nice sidewalk on one side with a planting strip, but unfortunately, this guy is walking on the other side where there is no sidewalk here. And again, there's no bike lanes currently on this part of DeMonte Drive. And then we've just got expansive parking lots and in general, just a bunch of underutilized space, which is all due to just an outdated development model. So just wanted to zoom in to sort of one piece of this site just to start, just because this is such a large site overall. I'm just going to zoom in while we talk about some of these ideas. So this, for reference, is the Home Depot building here. And then the Shaw's up here sticking out the corner. So we're talking about how to better treat DeMonte Drive. The first thing that we would talk about is bringing the buildings up to the street, just like we talked about before with the other sites. So pushing the parking to the back and creating a more active street edge here and a better environment for pedestrians and drivers down DeMonte Drive. And then we want to talk about streetscape improvements. So having wide sidewalks right up against these buildings that are now up at the edge, separated from the road by planted tree lawns, bike lanes, and also potentially some planted medians down a majority of DeMonte Drive. Things like this for the streetscape. So DeMonte Drive could potentially end up looking something more like this. So if you can pretend like this is the Home Depot or maybe the Target or one of those existing big box stores, and with these new liner buildings in the front can really change, the character and the activity of this area. So if we take those ideas and we zoom out to the whole site, we can start thinking about what this whole site might look like if we start applying those same ideas throughout the whole area. So starting with creating a street network and a network of walkable block sizes throughout the area. And in this example that we've shown, we've also included a linear park space or a linear green space as part of that plan. And then you can add on the development on top of that. So here we're showing a wide range of building types, ranging from just classic commercial and retail development, which we're showing in the red buildings. Again, the mixed use buildings in the purple, which could have housing or office above. And then a bunch of different housing types in the back. So ranging down from apartment buildings to quadplexes, to duplexes, townhomes, and even small lot single families. So creating a mix of uses in this area to really try and create a walkable community where people can, not only do their shopping, but also live and work all in this area, ideally.
I also want to point out the treatment of Loudon Road. You pulled some buildings up there to try to start that transformation to a more pedestrian friendly streetscape there.
Thank you. So does anyone have any comments or questions about this site and these ideas being applied to this sort of site?
I'll get to go first again. So I think this is one of the most adaptable sites for this type of development in the city. And I think it's also extremely important that the city comes up with a comprehensive development plan so that we ensure that this type of development can go forward, but will go forward. And the reason I say it's the most adaptable for a walkable, bikeable community is because all the services that people need for their daily lives are within walking distance of this area. So I'm very excited to see this type of proposal. I hope the city goes forward with a comprehensive development plan that's much more specific, and that will be a guide, more than a guide, virtually a requirement for future development in this area.
See, Anna has her hand raised.
Where you have, say, a landowner or a developer who sort of is generally known for just allowing their space in their property to fall into disrepair and not do anything about it. Is there a way, and I think of this as we're talking about the mall site, right? Is there a way to have the new zoning code drafted to disincentivize that? I think this is the type of development we want to incentivize. And I don't want to see large swaths of land held by landowners that just don't do anything with their property. And so I guess I'm just wondering how zoning can kind of help encourage those individuals into not letting their property just fall into disrepair.
I would think of it, and I'll let Lee or Kelsey jump in if they have other ideas, but I would think of it as a development pressure rather than a zoning. There's not much zoning can do to make someone develop, right? But if through the process that we're undergoing right now, showing what's possible, showing the community, getting this community feedback that this is what people want. There are developers out there who want to do this. And, seeing that we want to write a code to allow them to do this, put some pressure on the property owner, I think, to sort of say, hey, this is what the community wants. And, somebody's going to do this, and if it's not me. So I would think of it as more of a market pressure, if that makes sense. Lee or Kelsey, do you have any thoughts?
The only other issue is if there are continuing violations of either, the building or other life safety codes or other things, you can be tough about that in particular areas and try to, in a sense, hound the person into bringing something either fully back into compliance by renovating it or whatever else, or selling it off to someone else. So you can push a little bit with enforcement if there are actual violations on the property.
Mark, go ahead.
Be a little broken record here again. But when I look at this above, and I have no idea the scale of how many hundreds, maybe even thousands of people you'd be putting in with these, high density apartments, townhomes, quadplexes, all that great stuff. But I wonder, where are the kids going to play? There's not a lot of space that's sort of built into that. And I would just challenge us to think of ways, sort of Alan was saying, how do we think ahead, ahead of this zoning, so that this type of project doesn't go in, which is a huge improvement over what it is then, but then we're trying to figure out, where are the green spaces for people to go enjoy. So that I would just sort of challenge us to think about, how do we either bake that into the code or how do we proactively set aside spaces nearby so that these things that, families and people want to see are going to be there.
Mm-hmm. Roland?
I'd like to echo what Mark just said, but I'd like to also add, as I look at this, and I see a lot of red retail, and I'm thinking that the future of retail is online, so I'm not quite sure that we'll have quite the need for this much retail, physical retail. But again, we're talking about what the plan as written would allow. I can see that, that this would be nice rather than having, a large parking lot dominated by a large building. So I don't know, that's my only comment is the fact, I see a lot of red propose this retail, and I just don't really see a need going future for that many physical brick and mortar retail stores.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I would just, point out that retail, the red could be actual, like retail, but it also includes restaurants. So those could be, everything from restaurants to anything that's just basically not residential.
Yeah, and I understand that, and that's where I'm saying, I can see that this is a visualization of what the zoning would allow. But again, when you get to restaurants, we're talking turnover with restaurants because of how difficult it is to be successful as a restaurant owner. So I don't know. I'm just thinking that I'm wondering if we would end up, if someone were to build this, if we would end up with a lot of vacant buildings after a while.
So I would think, looking at this as a whole package, if a development like this was to go through, we would also want to be taking a serious look at a connection to 393. And then also being able to connect to the open space, the green space off of Portsmouth Street would provide an opportunity for the folks for a potential development for people to be able to access that either by walking or biking so that they wouldn't have to hop into their cars. So there is the potential, but only if those pieces are put into place and it's a comprehensive plan.
Yeah, this is great. I think this has been some, thank you, Alan. This has been some really good feedback. Maybe we should jump to the OCP since we're sort of running low on time, and that one's a little bit different from all these other examples.
Yeah, so the final site is the southern OCP site. So just south of downtown. So Water Street going into downtown right here, South Main Street lining this edge, and I-93 on this other edge here. The future for this area, and Heather, feel free to jump in on this one as much as you feel you need to. But we wanted to first look at possible, again, the street connections through this area. So Hall Street exists currently, which is filled with a bunch of commercial development, mainly some hotels and fast food restaurants and things like that up here. And then there's a portion, there's Langdon Ave that exists up until this rail line that divides this site here. So we are showing some possible future street network that also connects through the site, over the rail line once or twice, and then also up into downtown as well. And then we can, on the next slides, we'll take a look at these sort of three areas that we wanted to focus on. So sort of undevelopable marsh area, but then we have a commercial corridor area, and then the industrial flex area. So the undeveloped area, it's largely just a marsh, like it's a conservation area. So we wouldn't really be able to do much with this except for maybe a few nature trails. So this would stay pretty much as is in the future. But we can look at this Hall Street corridor area. So it's currently, small to large scale commercial uses. So you can see some of the hotels in this first image, and then you have some of these really nice older homes that have been converted to commercial properties along the street as well. But again, we have those limited pedestrian facilities. So there's definitely some potential for this area. So looking at some other examples, here's an example, this top picture from Charlotte, North Carolina, where they also have some older homes that have been converted to commercial properties. But you can see how just some streetscape improvements and activation of their front yard and making that an amenity space has really helped sort of activate this space as well. And then for the larger scale commercial development, again, just pulling those buildings up to the street rather than having them set back, 100 feet with a parking lot in between and these big blank facades that are currently along Hall Street. Just having some more activation requirements and things like that. as well as streetscape improvements, again, just promoting the walkability of this corridor. And then for the industrial flex area, which is, you know, we're thinking the majority of this southern OCP site. Currently, you know, there's a lot of industrial uses going on. Some historic buildings, especially along South Main Street, including the gas holder building up in the corner. But a lot of the space in the site is underutilized, and a lot of the uses that are currently there, including a lot of the uses that are currently taking place here are actually non-conforming uses currently in Concord. So if we look at the potential through the site, we could, by allowing a wider mix of uses through this site, make it more flexible, usable. So we could allow everything from commercial to personal services, retail uses, and as well as residential and possibly maker spaces or flexible art spaces. You could, as you kind of can see in this top picture example of an older industrial area from Charlotte, North Carolina, they've turned into a more flexible space. And then we can also talk about housing opportunities for this sort of area. And again, having people live and work in the same, potentially in the same building, but in the same area, and creating a more walkable mixed use community.
Can I jump in on this one?
Yeah.
I forget what the next slide is. Let me just make sure.
This is the last slide.
Oh, okay. So I think some of these examples are showing more, I don't know, maybe trendy examples of what you could do in this space, but part of the point as well, this is currently zoned, most of it OCP, which is why a lot of the existing uses are non-conforming because they're not permitted in OCP. But if we were to transform this into more of an industrial flex area, part of the point of that would be to make those uses conforming. In other words, it would allow a lot of the uses that are there to remain. So it would be easier for those folks to redevelop and do additional things on their properties because they would now be conforming. So not only would their current use be conforming, but they could put additional uses on there as well without having to get like a whole slew of variances because of their, the nonconformities that they currently have. So, there are examples of these types of districts that are more industrial or have more of a, of an industrial feel versus some of the examples we've shown here, which are dressed up a little more. Of course, there's some newer buildings, which is nice as well. But I just wanted to emphasize that part of the point of that is not to really change the uses or the character, but to allow the uses to continue and also expand or, create more of a mixed environment by allowing more flexibility in the area.
So I want to point out that, or I think it's important to point out that we want to be careful not to push out too much industrial opportunities or space. There's talk off of exit 17 between Hoyt and Sewell's Falls of putting in 600 residential units in an area that's currently zoned industrial, which doesn't allow for it. The question becomes is how do we also have to look at how do we afford all these residential units or these mixed uses if we don't have the revenue, the taxes to pay for the services that these new residential projects, these high density developments are going to bring to the city. So I think we also, while looking at how we want the city to look and how we want to mix in the uses, which I think is very important. It's one of the things that attracted me to form-based code. We also need to look at how it impacts the ability of the city to pay for the services that will allow the city to continue to be a great place to live. So if we don't want people having to drive outside the city or use their cars too much, these industrial sites are very important in attracting higher paying jobs for people who live in the community. and for making it easier for people to commute without using their cars to these types of jobs. So just something I think that we need to think about when looking at how we want to see some of these older sites that are difficult to develop because of past industrial uses. While it's may be attractive to look at changing the types of uses, I think we have to be careful of how we balance those new uses.
So Alan, just to clarify, because it's sounding to me like you're saying what I'm saying, because like currently this whole area is non-conforming. So none of these industrial uses that you're talking about are even allowed. So they wouldn't be able to redevelop or expand or do anything here.
Yes. So I don't want to ruin your reputation by agreeing with you, Heather, but I agree with you.
I mean, so what we're proposing is really more of what you're saying, which is, you know, allowing those uses to continue and, you know, allowing property owners to do more if they choose to on their sites without having to get a whole slew of variances for their existing uses.
Right. So I think what I'm trying to say is we need to find that balance. So somehow we need to do we need to look at how it impacts the ability to pay for the service. So if we allow X, Y, and Z to come in, does that create more expenses for the city, or does that generate more revenue for the city?
Yeah.
So that's you know, I don't know if there's a way to build that into the zoning that would allow us to do a metric or a test of when new development is proposed, how it impacts the ability for the community to afford it.
Yeah. And maybe Lee or Kelsey can jump in. I'm not immediately familiar with the financial breakdown of the statistics, but my understanding is that it's really single family development and very spread out sprawl that ends up not being able to pay for itself. I haven't seen too many statistics showing that multifamily or higher density residential has the same problem. I mean, it's one of the reasons why planners and urban planners encourage higher density because of its higher value and lower strain on municipal infrastructure and municipal services. So I'm inclined to say that if we were proposing this all be transitioned into single family housing, absolutely, we might have a problem. But the fact that we're proposing these higher density multifamily, and again, I defer to Lee if he has anything to add to that. Sorry to call you out, Lee.
That's quite all right. You can call away. Yes, you're right about the fiscal impacts. I understand Alan's issue about jobs in proximity to housing. That's a tough issue. If this were a successful, commercial retail entertainment place, there would be jobs. They are decent paying jobs, perhaps not as high paying as some industrial jobs might be, but industrial jobs are waning heavily, and they are going to larger and larger sites, these in-town sites, and the rail lines and some of those elements are less and less important parts of industrial siting. So I think this has been seen by the city as a long while as what the OCP designation was, an opportunity to regenerate something new. And we see it as the only area where you could potentially continue industrial type activities, whether that's a brewery or distillery or something, that has that industrial flavor to it, but can also be an entertainment facility. So this is quite the opportunity to have that kind of feeling and sense. There's enough land area, there's enough uses active down there already. There's some uses down there that could use a little cleaning up, and this would put an eye on the place and begin to clean up some of the existing uses, perhaps a little bit, that are stockpiling cars or other things down there. So yeah, there is both opportunity and challenge associated with this kind of site.
Jay, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. I've been jumping on and off, so I haven't heard the whole presentation, but thank you for letting me jump in here. I think this is a huge opportunity here in our city. I think this parcel with the arts community and the industrial nature of this is really cool. And I think we have some great opportunity here. Can everyone hear me? I don't know, my microphone went a little weird. Okay. All right. One of the things that I find really interesting with this area of the city, and again, this is just an observation, but we have Litherman's Brewery here. We've got 3 breweries in the city, right? We've got Litherman's here. We've got Feathered Friend that's up in this area, or maybe even a little further up. And then we have Concord Craft, which is a little further up here. But we have this rail line that actually connects all 3, which I think's kind of interesting. And I don't know if there's a way, again, not all based on beer, but it is based on experience. If you travel all 3 of those, or a distillery or something like that, it becomes a corridor, and this rail line becomes that corridor that connects them, which I think is kind of interesting in our city. But I think this does have some great potential of this industrial feel that the arts community, the maker community, and this flex community can use this space in a different way than other parts of the city. So this is exciting to me.
Jay, you're absolutely right. If you look at the Beltline in Atlanta and the kinds of uses it's beginning to get, and the Swamp Rabbit Trail, which is a rail trail in surrounding Greenville, South Carolina, brewery is the #1 use, wanting to build immediately adjacent to those locations. They're both highly bikeable, highly walkable settings, and so yeah, I think you're exactly right. We see that possibility as well.
Looks like, yeah, so Mark commented in the chat that he likes the flexibility and possibilities of this sort of district might open up. You could see it as a draw for younger residents. And then Anna commented that a biking and walking only corridor between these spaces would be incredible. And that's actually, we're right at the end of our time. If anybody has any last quick comments, but I think that's maybe going to be it for us today.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating and for joining. I encourage you to, share this with others and have them go on and watch it or come to the next meetings. It's been a really great turnout and great participation and some really good feedback. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.